Welcome back to the Building Bigger Lives podcast. Today, we're going to do something a little bit different. And we get a lot of questions about our podcast, how we organize it, how it started, kind of just the behind the scenes. So we thought it'd be fun to do a behind the scenes of our podcast at this episode. And with that, I'm going to welcome my wonderful co-host, Michael Regan. Michael, good to see you.
Always good to be with you, Kathryn. Yeah, this is a fun one. It gives us a chance to maybe pause and reflect a little bit on what we're doing, how we got here, and maybe why we made some of the choices we made. So I love the topic. Let's throw the ball out into the court and pick up a game.
Okay, good. Well, one of the questions I get is how we thought of the idea and how it started. And then we might have different perspectives on this. So I want to hear your perspective first.
Well, I think we definitely have different perspectives, but that's only because I think we each independently had an idea that at some point got merged together in this. But at some point along the way, I'll tell you what I remember. I remember back in 2019, you were coming up with some creative ideas as you were preparing your business plan for 2020. And so this would have been fall of 2019. We're having a discussion, and one of the things we had talked about was you were living in a small town that had really, sort of this big reputation. A lot of people know about Steamboat. A lot of people travel to Steamboat. A lot of people are curious about it, and yet you know a lot of the stories about some of the locals and the small business owners and things that seemed to me to be very interesting stories to tell. And as someone who's, a full-time professional in the housing industry with a specific role in mortgage lending, I thought, well, gosh, that'd be a fun story to tell. And I remember encouraging you to like, what would that look like if you could tell some of those stories? And my memory says we played around with a couple of ideas. One could have been, some sort of like Facebook page or meetup group, or I don't know. But somehow we landed on what if you hosted a podcast? And my memory was that led to some iterations of planning and even I think some equipment that got purchased. You're nodding, so am I remembering
Yeah.
the framework of the
Yes.
story pretty
Yes.
closely?
Yep.
Okay, so pick up where I'm leaving the gaps.
Yeah. So I was definitely creating a podcast. I even recorded an episode, but didn't hit all the right buttons. So it didn't end up actually recording. I don't know if you even know that. But
Not know that.
and then after that 2020 hit, and it was absolute insanity, and there was no way I could spend the appropriate amount of time on it. And so it kind of got tabled, and it was still rattling around in my brain. And then I'll let you tell the next part.
Well, I think as I remember this as well, that every year when we were doing the planning process, I probably was asking, what about that idea? Not knowing you had already recorded an episode. This is like true confessions live on the Building Bigger Lives podcast. That's great. I didn't know you had recorded one, but I knew that you were really geared up for it. It wasn't like a random idea. I mean, you went out and bought the mixer. You went out and bought the recording device. You had the light, the microphone, all the things you needed.
Right.
And so in my mind, I'm thinking, well, hey, is now the time? Is now the time? And to your point, my memory is very acute of the way 2020 and 2021 went. They were both gangbusters, runaway years in terms of your areas of focus, which was, helping people secure what may turn out to be the best financing scenarios they've ever seen. And even first quarter of 22 was still cooking at a pretty decent pace. So even any planning we would have done heading into 22 didn't seem like, oh, now's the right time for that idea. It probably wasn't until we got to the second half of 22 to where we could at least entertain that idea again. And somewhere around that same time, I had a different idea for something that felt less like a podcast and more like a live stream. I really liked the idea of hosting some version of a YouTube live event specific to coaching topics, which of course would, bleed over into the housing industry because that's where a lot of my clients work. But I started having that idea. And what I remember was as I was, coaching you toward, stoking this idea back to life, I'm also separately having a different idea, and neither one of us were really getting that in play. It felt like we both had something that was keeping us from saying, burn the ships, I'm all in, we're doing it. And it was at some point coming into 2024, so this would have been fall of 23 now, that I remember saying to you, look, I'm going to throw a different angle at this idea and just see what you think. And I remember saying, what if we took your idea and my idea and we tried to mash them up into something that ended up being the Building Bigger Lives podcast? How close am I so far? Am I way
Yeah,
off
it's
base?
great. It's great. It's fun to hear you tell the story.
Well, it was fun to live it because I think what you brought to the table, if I'm going to be fair to you with the credit, was you had already done some of the legwork with our friend Scott Higby, who shout out to Scott with Studio C. He is our executive producer. He engineers our podcast. He makes sure that you guys get a flawless version of this on Apple and Spotify every week, and a video copy that we repurpose out on YouTube a week later. And and you had really worked closely with Scott to get the found. So we didn't have to go back and start over with that. We just had to really
Mhm.
bring that into the here and now and then come up with some clarity over what was this podcast idea going to be if it's no longer exactly your vision or exactly mine? How could we work those together? And I'll tell you, Kathryn, from a personal point of view, that was when it got exciting because I'm a collaborator by nature. I
Mm.
prefer collaboration. When I write music, I prefer writing with someone. I'm not the guy who sits alone at his piano and bangs out a song, and before you know it, it's ready to go. I'm much better when I work in a collaborative environment. And so you and I getting to collaborate on this really accelerated my interest and anticipation. And of course, we kicked off January of 2024, and here we go. Depending on the drop date that those of you are listening to this episode, it's about a year strong and really leading towards some new creativity that could be fun in the year ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's great. And I think that kind of gives some of the background. So let's talk through kind of some of the organization around that. Because one of the questions I get is it really difficult to come up with topics?
Mm.
And how did you guys come up with so many topics? So talk to me a little bit about that.
Well, again, this would be a great illustration of our collaboration. I think both of us brought ideas to the table. I remember having a long list of ideas that were on my
Mhm.
iPhone notes, and at some point, I remember you very graciously reminding me, we could take those same notes and put them in a tool called Monday, and that might allow us to share and collaborate a little bit differently on those, and gives us far more option on how to manage those because notes are going to be pretty basic. So I gave you credit for, let's deport my ideas there. You added yours as well. And what we started to do then was meet regularly way before we launched a date to record. We were really mapping out. I mean, what was it, Kathryn? Like 4 dozen ideas. We had a lot of
Yeah.
topical ideas before we ever recorded an episode. And I think what we started doing, if my memory is correct, was we sorted through those and said, how can we keep the topics simple enough that we can bring a lot of energy to them? They don't get complicated, they don't get boring. And how do we weave in guests occasionally to help augment them? So we picked some episodes that we felt might do better with a guest, others where we featured you or featured me. And sometimes we just talked them through. But my memory of how we got organized was it was a big brain dump on the front end,
Hmm.
a lot of sorting and organizing, and then a lot of, batching them based on either our level of excitement for the idea, like we both had an
Hmm.
idea in common, or something that as one of us explained the idea, the other one woke up to and said, "Ooh, I like that. It just became really fun. And so that's my memory of how we started sorting those. And again, credit to you with the idea of Monday. Your team uses that very effectively as a business management tool, but you showed me it was a great tool to use for podcast management as well.
Yeah, it's worked out well for us as far as figuring out what we're doing and what's next and what's coming up and who are the guests we want and who needs to contact them. So all the things. And I think for me, just looking at it more philosophically, I don't think it's been difficult to come up with the topics because there's so many things we've talked about over the years being coached by you that we can say, oh, yeah, we actually haven't talked about this, or we've talked about a version of this, but we could definitely dig into that topic a little bit more. So I tell people overall, it hasn't been hard to come up with topics at all. And so that part's been fairly easy so far, especially once we throw guests into it. And then we also have done a couple book club ones, which have been really fun as well. So that I think spices it up a little bit as well, because there's so many good business books out there, and those have been fun to talk about with you. So,
Yeah, when I look back at the batching that we did, and you're highlighting a few of those common groups, whether it was guest groups or book club groups or some stuff we did that would be more, you might call them traditional coaching topics. Other
mm,
topics were more relevant to current events, like when we did the NAR settlement episode. That was really important at that moment to have a voice in that, and so we've been flexible to work our way through those as we felt the audience would be interested in something. And as you said, when it was time to mix it up a little, let's throw in a book club. When it's time to mix it up a little, let's bring a guest on. And I think that if our audience is listening and curious about that, I would say that's a great example of the benefit of collaboration. When you're
mm,
working with someone whose style is similar enough to you that you're going to have some simpatico, because that's one thing our feedback we get regularly is, well, you guys seem like you ebb and flow really well. You ask each other questions or you give each other room to speak. Nobody's arguing and talking over each other. And so I would say that is not something we orchestrated. That just came naturally in our natural style. So that made it really easy, I think, to then trust each other when someone said, I think this is really the way we should go with this. And I don't remember us having a big tug of war over too many of those topics.
no, not at all. Everything's been easy on that end of things. And the other question I get, which is an easy one to answer, is we are not scripted at all, any way, shape, or form. And I think that's also helps the authenticity of the podcast. And we might come up with a couple of questions that we want to ask or a couple topics that we don't want to forget to bring up. But we have never scripted anything at all. I would say even the things we're doing multiple takes of have been the intro and outro, but that is about it. So
Yeah,
the
for integrity, I was going to say exactly that. I said, I think I remember us scripting our intro
yeah,
and our outro simply because we needed those to, like, there were very specific
yeah.
things we needed to hit. But you're right, outside of those, and that goes back to when we were melding our two visions into one, that came from when I wanted to do this as a YouTube live.
Mhm.
I don't know if our audience knows this, and I don't talk about it a lot, but my background is in broadcast journalism. So I graduated with a degree. I had a radio show. I did some things on air as a younger person and really enjoyed the format of radio the best, far more than television. And not the old, I have a, face for radio joke, although true. I really, I like the format of radio because it's not so boxy. I don't really want to read the teleprompter because that doesn't feel authentic to me. I don't really want
Yeah.
to have to hit the mark by the second because then we're not giving maybe our guest a chance to land their point, or we're not giving each other an opportunity to really tie it down. So radio gives you a little more flexibility to do that. And I wanted to bring the spirit of that into what I thought was going to be YouTube Live. So when we recorded the podcast, the temptation is like, well, we can always edit that later. And, Scott will vouch for us. It's not just that we don't script, we don't do a lot of post editing either. I mean, I think the one that comes to mind is I remember my sweet dog Harley decided to get really excited, and I was worried that we had dog barking in an episode. Only to find out later, you told me, Michael, your microphone didn't pick that up at all. So I think we even sent him on an editing project that didn't even need to happen.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I know and that's one thing I like is we kind of just our conversation just flows. And because of that, I think we cover things that are real and are really facing people. And we just, talk about it, which is great. I think there needs to be more of that. So another thing that I want you to bring up is because we talked about this a lot at the beginning, is let's talk a little bit about how we choose guests,
Hmm.
because I think that's something that is near and dear to your heart. So let's talk about that together.
Well, I love when we triangulate the podcast. And by triangulate, I mean that you and I get to play host, co-host, and guest. In fact, the term you'll hear me use sometimes, and so maybe our audience has picked up on it, is it goes back to my time doing radio play-by-play, where I said, the play-by-play is a different role than the color. And what you want to
Yeah.
make sure that you give as the play-by-play is really keeping the audience up to speed with the topic, but giving the person who's on the color role the chance to really expand upon that. And that's where I think you really shine, Kathryn, because as an active listener, which is just a natural gift, and I know it's a coaching topic, but in your case, I never felt like I really had to work hard on that one with you. You're a
Mhm.
naturally curious person. You really enjoy connecting with people, both personally and professionally. And so asking questions as an active listener is a really natural style for you. So for me,
Mhm.
I love when we choose guests that are comfortable with me setting something up and then you digging in. And then what's been fun is we sometimes flip that around.
Mhm.
If any of our friends have ever watched us on the YouTube version of these podcasts, they sometimes might have picked up if we if our camera angle allowed it. We sometimes even point to each other to say, "You take this one, I'll take that one,"
Yeah.
and that's been a really nice thing. I think your real question was around, literally though, how we choose those guests. And I guess the best answer I would give to that, once I acknowledge how much I enjoy it, is I'm always looking for people who have an interesting story that we can give them a platform to tell it. And I think back to guests like, Kim Mason. I think back to guests like John Donnelly. I think back to Ken Perry, how exciting that was. Even
Mhm.
back to our old friend Todd Bookspan, who was one of our earlier guests. Great. Sean McCluskey was an interesting one. There were just
Yeah.
great guests this year. I know I'm just highlighting a few, and there are others, but the point is, I'm always looking for folks that have an interesting story. And then, two, they're not the story or the guest you typically hear somewhere else. So, Amy Ayler recently fell into this category. Just an amazing energy she brought to that episode, but not somebody you see on everybody's podcast. So it was fun to
Mhm.
bring someone in who brought a perspective that we loved hearing from, and we hope our
Yeah.
audience enjoyed it as well.
And another thing I'm going to remind you that you said is I want to give a voice to people who maybe don't get a stage and don't have a platform, but need to be heard. And I think that was an important piece of this podcast and of our guests. Sometimes, absolutely, we get some people who have some pretty good platforms, but there's a lot of people who don't, and there's a lot of people who have a great story to tell. And I think that those are really fun is to hear from those people. So I hope we'll continue to get guests like that on the podcast.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Yeah, and maybe you said it more eloquently because you remembered something I said specifically, and I appreciate that. You're good at that too, Kathryn. Is you've reminded me over the recording of these. Hey, remember we talked about that on a previous episode, and I think that's another gift you have is you're really great in that spirit of making sure that we're showing some continuity between these subjects, that these aren't just random popcorn topics or random guests that we brought in, or some random book we just picked. I mean, we really try to be intentional about
Mhm.
creating an ebb and a flow so that these themes, if someone's following along each week with us, there's a sense of, okay, they're starting to get the bigger picture of what building bigger lives is really all
Mhm.
about. Okay, let me flip the script. You've asked some really good questions. When we put this into play, was there anything in your mind that you thought, okay, I'm either nervous about that or I'm not really sure how that's going to go, that you look back on now and think, oh, that went so much easier than I thought it was going to?
So I think I've told you this, but I'm going to be pretty authentic here. Initially, I was like, I wonder if Michael's just doing this because he knows it's on my list. And as a coach, he's being like this sacrificial podcast lamb. So if you can't see him, he's laughing. So I think I probably checked in with you 52 times to say, hey Michael, is this something you like you're still really into? Are you having fun? Is this good? Is this good?
Mm.
And I think that comes a little bit from that imposter syndrome of like, wow, because I was really, really honored when you asked me to be on a podcast with you because you have so much knowledge and so much insight. So I thought, wow, this is like a really big honor. Why me? So I think that that was really the only thing I was worried about. And I wanted to
Mm.
make sure I was really adding value to the podcast and adding value to the guests and adding value to our audience as much as possible. And so that's what I think about every day is, okay, great. What can I do to get the word out about our podcast? And what can I do to add value in every single episode? So I think that's what I think about. I don't get caught up in my head about, am I going to say the right thing? I just want to make sure I'm adding value.
Well, I'm glad that you had an opportunity to let the audience know that that's a very real and authentic thought. But just to affirm you, not only has that not occurred to me in that context, if anything, and you know, my wife Lori will vouch for this. I get she's like, I can tell on the days when, you know, you guys are going to be recording because I have an energy for this that is, it really helps buoy the work that I get to do because I love one-on-one coaching. I mean, that is absolutely my favorite thing to do. So
Mhm.
if you think about the ways in which someone gets mentally prepared to coach 40 some odd people, I mean, that's a lot of details to keep track of. And, you know, certainly sleeping, certainly eating, certainly exercising, all the things I would coach any of my clients to do are part of that. But this podcast has become kind of a secret sauce. It's a way for me to exercise some thoughts with
Mhm.
you in such a really energizing setting or comfortable setting, meaning this isn't heavy lifting. I really do look forward to this. So, you know, Lori will vouch for me. There's never been a thought of, oh man, how did I get roped into this podcast with Kathryn? It's the opposite. I'm really thankful. And let me give credit beyond just you and I. I really thank Building Champions for getting behind
Mhm.
us as our title sponsor to this entire production. You know, we're not an official Building Champions podcast. That was part of our intention when we started was we want to make sure this represents the two of us and we're not just here to sell the brand of Building Champions. But without a doubt, we're both products of that coaching
Yeah.
company and we believe, you know, very deeply in the value that we've received from it. And it's a real blessing for me to be able to get on here with you and to be able to demonstrate to, you know, hundreds, if not thousands of people that, you know, this is what our investment of time in Building Champions has produced. And now we're sharing it with you. And that's why we called it Building Bigger Lives. We wanted to take, you know, a tip of the cap to our name and then carry it forward. And I love that you and I get to do this together. This
Yeah.
is one of my favorite things every time we record.
And I'm gonna kind of sneak something in here. So if we have the dates right, this will be our 50th episode. And because of that, I think that this is the perfect topic to discuss for that. And this has been just a really good kind of reminder of everything we've done over the last 50. And so I think that there's some celebration that is involved with that. So, Michael, in saying that, kind of looking over the last year, what's your favorite moment that you can think of off the cuff? I did not
Yeah.
prep him for this, poor guy.
Yeah, no. Well, remember, it would be weird if we did because then you'd say, "Really, we're not scripted?" You just said we're not
That's
scripted.
right.
Um, I can tell you right off the bat, what's been exciting to me is that we have found a way to publish an episode every single week of this year since we started. So we didn't start the first week of January, but since January when we started, we have found a way to do that. I really, I, as a guy who believes, you know, we read Atomic Habits. It's one of the books we talked about. And one
Yeah.
of my favorite quotes from James Clear is he says, we don't tend to rise to the level of our goals. We tend to fall to the level of our systems. You and I created a system that allows us, come rain or shine, come spring, summer, winter, or
Mm,
fall, to find a way to get our episodes recorded and publish them. And that is a attribute that I coach on. So it's fun to be able to demonstrate that
mhm,
to our audiences, you know, hey, you know, life's not perfect. I guess something could happen in the future that would
mhm.
disrupt that. So I'm not going to sit here and make some bold claim only to find out that I'm incapable of recording these with you in the future. But it's absolutely my intention that we keep up that pace because that's something I'm really proud of. I mean, you can go
Yeah.
back and find this is really our 50th episode. That's crazy. We can go back and find 50 episodes of our podcast that we get to share, and they live in perpetuity on a platform that you get to choose, whether it's Apple, whether it's Spotify, or whether it's YouTube. I'm pretty proud of that, Kathryn. That's awesome.
Yeah. Yeah, that's definitely one of my wins for this year, that's for sure. Another thing that I think there's a couple things that hit me is when people will talk to me about the podcast and say, "Oh my gosh, I love listening to you guys. I get something every time." Or, "Holy cow, I can't believe you guys have been so consistent." Or, "I had a friend last week who found the podcast organically, and that just made me really proud." So, I think knowing that it's making an impact for people is those moments. So please, if you are listening, let us know and let us know what's impacting you, because that definitely is great to hear, because those are the moments it's like, yes, we're not just like talking to each other, which we can do forever. So we're going to do that anyway, but we want to talk to all of you. So that's I think what's really jazzed me up over the last year.
So, Kathryn, I think it's probably time that we bring this flight into the terminal. But before we hit the end of the recording, looking ahead at 2025 through the
Mhm.
lens of the Building Bigger Lives podcast, anything that comes to mind that you really would get excited about as we continue this venture into a new year?
I think for me, we've kind of got our stride, right? So you start to run and you're like buying new shoes and figuring out what fits and what doesn't and how much water to carry. Well, we have all that figured out. So now we can really focus in on, you know, just increasing our impact, increasing our exposure, and just hopefully it'll continue to go as smooth as it has, and we'll get some great guests on who will also be fun and continue to jazz up this awesome podcast.
Sounds good to me. I think that's a wrap, not just on this episode of Building Bigger Lives, but apparently on 50 episodes, which is a great little mile marker for us. And I'm really, really happy that you pointed that out. If you're enjoying our podcast, thanks for listening today. Thanks for tuning in on a regular basis. And thanks for sharing our episodes when you find someone who you know would value either the topic that we've brought to that particular podcast, or maybe they would just like the style of the way you guys work with entrepreneurial people who need a positive voice and who are helping people focus on building a bigger life, both at home and at work. It's my pleasure to wrap this episode. We'll look forward to seeing you on an episode soon. And I hope for all of you, you'll continue to join us in 2025 on the next episode of Building Bigger Lives.